Good morning. It's funny when you get up here, you plan and go, oh yeah, I know what I'm going to say. I've got my notes. It's all going to be fine. And then you stand up here and you go, wow, there's some people out there. So, as Tom said, this is the last session on Jonah. The topic that I'm actually going to speak about is who deserves God's mercy. And we're going to be looking at Jonah, but we're also going to have a little look at another story in the Bible as well. You've made it to the last week. Hopefully it's not going to be terrible of the last session of Jonah. I'll try and make it good. But what I wanted to do is just do a quick recap of the story of Jonah, just in case you haven't been here for all 11 weeks. So we've heard how this prophet heard from God. He was told to go and tell the Ninevites to change their ways. He didn't want to do what God was asking him. So like a true EastEnder might, he tried to leg it to Spain. He hid on a boat. The boat was about to get smashed to bits in a storm sent by God, and then the sailors threw him overboard. The storm stops. He gets swallowed up by a massive fish. He stays in the fish for 3 days. He says sorry to God. He gets sicked up out of the mouth of the fish, and then God says again for him to go and tell the Ninevites to turn from their wicked ways. This time, he goes. He gives a psycho preach of 8 words. The whole city changed their ways. And then he gets angry. He strops off to a hill overlooking the city. He gets super hot in a heat storm sent by God. He takes shelter under a plant supplied by God. And he's asked by God if he's right to be angry. And he says yes. He actually says he's so angry that he wants to die. He's asked by God if he understands why God wants to save Nineveh. And he doesn't answer. The end. So there we have it. That's the story of Jonah. I could have saved us all 11 weeks. But this morning, I want to focus in on some key themes that I think that God wants us to hear this morning. And those 3 points, like all good sermons, I'm pretending I know what I'm doing. Jonah's heart is the first point. God's heart, and then our hearts. So before we get cracking, I want to set a few principles in place. First, my role this morning isn't here to judge, it's to nudge. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm not standing here by any means saying that I've got this cracked. Those of you who know me well know that I'm a work in progress. But the key word here is progress. And that's what I want to help us all do this morning. Not judgment, but a nudge in the right direction. Helping us all to individually take a look at our own hearts and see what they're really like. Second, I want to challenge the narrative that we've all been told in 2 Bible stories. This is when Tom gets a bit nervous. But I do want to challenge stuff. One is the story of Jonah, no surprise there. The other is the story of the lost son. Okay, so first off, let's look a little bit about Jonah. So when I say Jonah, what everyone then thinks is, and the whale. Well, I'd like to change that. And I'm not talking about that, it wasn't a whale, it was a big fish debate. I actually want to give the story a thorough rebrand. I'd like it in the future that when you hear Jonah, you don't hear Jonah and the whale, but you hear Jonah and his heart was stale. Ooh. So let's practice that. Let's say it together. Jonah and his heart was stale. Perfect. So the other story that we're going to take a look at is the story of the prodigal son. And herein lies the problem, because we've even called it the parable of the prodigal son, whereas actually it's called the parable of the lost son. And it's actually a story that Jesus told about two sons. It's meant to be called the parable of the lost son because that makes us wonder which son is lost. It's not just about the obviously naughty one who runs away, the prodigal. It's also about the older one who goes nowhere. I'd like to argue that actually it's the older one who's most lost. Now, third, let me give you a quick definition of mercy. If we're trying to answer the question who deserves God's mercy, we need to know what mercy means. Now, to do this, I'd like to quote the very, very Right Reverend Mr. Thomas Sexton, who told us a few weeks back that mercy is not getting what we deserve, whereas grace is getting what we don't deserve. Mercy is not getting what we deserve. God's mercy means not getting from God what our actions, our hearts, and our behaviour deserve. Okay, so that's the principles. Now we're ready to get started. So, first point, let's look at Jonah's heart. As we look at Jonah, I want us to see a man that has clearly been used by God. He's a godly man. He's a prophet, after all. He was actually called the son of Amittai, which means truth in Hebrew. So his name was the Son of Truth. And we'll see in chapter 4, he lived up to this name as he couldn't hide the fact that he was angry with God. So what was he angry about? Well, in verse 2, it says, "But to Jonah this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. And he prayed to the Lord, 'Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was at home? This is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love.'" Jonah didn't want God to save the people of Nineveh. Why? Well, the only evidence that I can find is because he was judgmental. He was effectively racist. The people of Nineveh, the Assyrians, were an enemy of the Israelites. He didn't like them because of where they came from and what he believed they stood for, all based on the actions of the Ninevites. And to be fair, some of their actions were pretty horrendous. Jonah didn't want God to forgive them. He wanted them wiped out. And we can see from his actions just how cross he was. He says, "But the Lord replied to him, 'Is it right for you to be angry?' And Jonah says, oh no, wait a minute. Jonah says absolutely nothing. He ignores God. His behaviour is like that of a petulant kid that doesn't get his own way in a supermarket, lying on the floor, or a stroppy teenager who stomps upstairs, slams their door. 120,000 Ninevites have just turned from their violent ways. You'd think Jonah would be, well, running some small groups, maybe in there doing a few alpha courses, helping them sort themselves out. But no, he's up on a hill, he's cross at God, and he's watching, he's waiting, he's hoping that they mess up. He's hoping that God unleashes his anger against them, because that's what he wants. His heart has become hardened. He's so cross, in fact, that he wants to die. Now, make no mistake here. I don't think that it's wrong to be angry at God. I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. If anything, I think it's good that if we're cross with God, that we're honest and we tell him. He knows our hearts after all. So what have we got to hide? Where I think Jonah falls down is when he says, Isn't this what I said? This is where the danger lies. Jonah's basically telling the God of heaven and earth, the maker of the universe, I told you so. Which is the same as saying, I know best. Or to put another way, I want to be God of my life. So let's just take a quick look at what Jonah's message to the Ninevites was. He says in chapter 3, verse 4, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overturned. Now I think this is interesting. Is it possible that Jonah is also angry at God because God's mercy to the Ninevites made Jonah look a bit like a rubbish prophet? What Jonah said wasn't, repent in 40 days and God will save you. He clearly went out and he said, in 40 days, Nineveh will be ruined. Now, because of God's mercy, that didn't happen. So the fact is, however you cut it, Jonah was shown to be wrong. So Jonah wasn't just stroppy about the fact that God saved his enemies. He was also stroppy about the fact that on this occasion, potentially he was made to look a bit of a naff prophet. Now, as if that wasn't enough to make Jonah angry, as we heard from Tom last week, whilst he was out on his stroppy hill, God supplied Jonah with a plant for him to shelter under. And Jonah really loved his plant. And then God sent a worm to eat that plant up. That made Jonah even more cross. He's furious. And then God said to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry about the plant? Pretty much the same question as the one that Jonah ignored earlier on. But this time, there's no silent treatment. Oh no, there's no cold shoulder from Jonah this time. He's straight back at God and he is spitting chips. It is, he says. And I'm so angry that I wish I was dead. Once angry at God, it seems that Jonah is now finding it pretty easy to be angry pretty regularly. Once a certain type of behaviour is shown, we can get in a rut that sometimes becomes our go-to behaviour. What's becoming your go-to behaviour? What poor behavioural patterns have become acceptable in our lives? And that's with your relationship with other people, with those around you, with your loved ones, with people you work with people you see every day, as well as with your relationship with God. So taking a step back, what is it that we see here with Jonah's behaviour? Why is he so blinking angry? Well, in short, I think he's self-righteous. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's look at the dictionary definition. The definition of self-righteous is having a certainty, especially an unfounded one, that one is totally correct or morally superior. Jonah is morally superior, or he thinks he is. He thinks he's better than the Ninevites. Here's the problem. Jonah knows best. I know better than you. I'm better than you. Sorry, Mark, that was a bit felt the thing to me. Now, I'm sure that we're all sat here thinking, naughty Jonah. How on earth could he got it all so wrong? I'm sure, like me, you never look at others and position yourself against them. I'm sure you never pull up to the lights and look at the car next to you and think, I've got a nicer car than you. I'm sure when you're at the bar, there's someone there in an outfit, you never look at their trainers and think, I've got nicer trainers than you. I'm sure that you never think, well, I might not be the best person in the world, but at least I'm not as bad as them. Look at what so-and-so gets up to. Look at what they spend their time doing. Look at what they spend their money on. I'm sure you never think or say any of those things. Well, let's hold those uncomfortable thoughts for now, and let me remind you of principle number 1. I'm not standing here to judge, but to nudge. So keep those thoughts in your head as we take a look at the story of the lost son. Now, I know Steve did an amazing job a couple of weeks ago looking at this, but we're going to focus on the second half of the story. This is the bit I think people conveniently forget. So let's take a look at the older son's heart. We're going to start wide and then we're going to come in close. This passage is only captured in Luke in chapter 15. So let's have a quick look at the context of the story. This is Jesus telling the story, and I think it's really important for us to think of the context, because actually the basis of why I think we've got the narrative slightly wrong lies in the context. So let's have a look at the scene. Jesus is sat amongst outcasts, the socially unacceptable, sinners and tax collectors. It says in verse 1, the tax collectors and the sinners were gathering round, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were muttering, "This man welcomes sinners and he eats with them," they muttered. So here's the first lesson from this. When it comes to Jesus, be someone who gathers round, not someone who mutters. Mutterers lead to trouble. Now, Jesus understands where the Pharisees are at. He understands their heart. And so he starts to tell some stories. He was the most awesome storyteller. We call them parables. First, he tells the story of the lost sheep. One of 100 sheep goes missing. The shepherd leaves 99 to go and find the lost one. Then he tells the parable of the lost coin. A lady's got 10 coins and she loses one. So she stops everything to find it. And when she does, she calls her friends and her neighbours and they get together and they celebrate. And then Jesus tells a third story, the parable of the lost son. Now I find it interesting to see how Jesus seems to be becoming or getting more and more intimate as the stories go on. He starts with a story of 100 sheep, one going missing and going to find it. Then 10 coins, one going missing. Then a father with 2 sons. Now we heard from Steve a couple of weeks ago how amazing this story is from the point of view of the younger son, the prodigal. And absolutely it is. It's probably one of my favourite stories in the Bible. But when you look at who Jesus is telling the story to, what do we really think Jesus is trying to say? So let's have a look at the actual passage. Let's look at the actual story in Luke chapter 15, verse 25. It says, "Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and he asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has come back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you gave me not even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you killed the fatted calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you're always with me and everything I have with you. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. To this audience, the Pharisees, those that were listening on, the heart of this story isn't around the younger son. As Jesus was talking, they could see the sinners, the wayward sons and daughters, because they were all around Jesus. They were why Jesus was telling the story. So let's reshape this narrative. Jesus told this story to hit the hearts of the Pharisees. And what were their hearts like? Wait a minute. They were self-righteous. Just like Jonah was. They thought they were better than the sinners and the tax collectors. They thought that by keeping rules, by working hard, they could earn God's love. They thought they were morally superior. So what did Jesus want this story to say to them? Let's look at some of the key bits of the older son's story. The older son was in the field working. He heard music and dancing. He asked a servant, "What's going on?" The servant said, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry. He refused to go in, so the father came out and pleaded with him. Remember the stroppy Jonah on the hillside? Sound familiar? But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you, and you never, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends." Let's pull a couple of bits out here. The father says, "This brother of yours." We need to see others as our brothers and sisters.